Hello and welcome to WinksThinks. This is a new podcast which will feature audio essays about everything from current events to philosophy, culture, politics, film, the works. I am your host, Sean Winkler, and welcome to our very first episode. Now, for the first episode, I thought I would talk about a film, which is from 2007. It's a film directed by David Fincher and a screenplay by James Vanderbilt. It's called Zodiac. Now, the primary source material for the screenplay was Robert Graysmith's Zodiac and Zodiac Unmasked, but Fincher and Vanderbilt together conducted a lot of their own research as well. The film had a somewhat lukewarm box office performance. It was budgeted at $65 million and made around $84.8 million, which in the world of movies is not a lot. But it has been placed on several top 10 lists from the year 2007, including number 1 on Time Out New York and on the Washington Post. It's also since been listed on several Best Films of the 21st Century so far lists, including the BBC's. There are two versions of the film. There's a theatrical cut, which runs at around 157 minutes, and there's a director's cut with an additional 5 minutes added to the film. Now, what is Zodiac about? Well, in part, it's about events surrounding a serial killer in Northern California in the late 1960s and the 1970s who called himself the Zodiac. Zodiac is confirmed to have murdered 5 people and to have injured 2. Possible that there were more. Now, in addition to the murders, the Zodiac is known for having written a series of letters, around 20, to various newspapers, mostly in the Bay Area, in which he taunts the police, the press, and the public. The letters run from the late 1960s until 1978, and in the final letter, the Zodiac claims to have killed 37 people in total. In 4 of the letters, Zodiac includes cryptograms, or hidden messages. To date, only one of these has been solved, the first from the 31st of July 1969, parts of which were sent to the Times-Herald, the Examiner, and the Chronicle. The 3rd letter, from the 20th of April 1970, claims to contain the Zodiac's identity. After the last letter, the Zodiac went silent. There have been over 2,500 suspects in the case, but ultimately, the killer was never found, and the case remains open in Napa, Riverside, Vallejo, and while it was temporarily closed in San Francisco, it was reopened again in March of 2007. If you're interested in more about the case, I would recommend 2 documentaries, both of which are available on YouTube. The first is called This is the Zodiac Speaking, and the other is His Name was Arthur Lee Allen, Allen having been one of the prime suspects in the case. One of the funny things about the movie is that although it's called Zodiac, the Zodiac killer is only in the film for a fraction of the running time. And that's because Fincher is not really interested here in making a biopic about a serial killer. Instead, he's interested in the people involved in the case, in the press, in the law enforcement, and in the wider public, and how it affected their lives. Fincher wants to explore the experiences and the emotions that these people underwent over the course of some 22 years, from July 1969 to August 1991. He shows the evolution of the case, how the early hopes of catching the killer turn to disillusionment as the months and years go by, and people slowly have to come to terms with the possibility that the task that they had invested so much of their lives in may never come to fruition, that the Zodiac will never be caught, and that his identity will forever remain unknown. Fincher nicely summarizes what he was aiming for in this film in a short documentary on the making of it called This is Zodiac, which is also available on YouTube. Here, he says, quote, "This is not a film about aggrandizing a serial killer. It's about the people who were left in the wake, the people who had to pick up and move on when it was all over." Most of the film's attention is devoted to Robert Graysmith, a political cartoonist for the San Francisco Chronicle, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. But it also focuses on Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong, detectives for the SFPD, played by Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards, as well as Robert Avery, a columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle, played by Robert Downey Jr. There are numerous secondary and tertiary characters in the film as well, who based on the strength of their performances are all memorable, even when they may be on screen for only but a few brief moments. So that's really the background and the plot of the movie. For the remainder of the podcast, I want to focus on one of the main themes of the film, a film that I'd like to call The Spectre of the Zodiac. By that phrase, I mean the way in which the enigma of the Zodiac comes to haunt the public imagination, how the case becomes about more than simply catching a killer. In reality, somewhere out there is or was a Zodiac killer, a flesh and blood human being, just like you and me, save for the fact that he was someone sick, someone who took pleasure in the murder, maiming, or traumatizing of innocent victims. But in the public imagination, Zodiac becomes something more than just a person. He takes on the status of being a boogeyman. Other commentators have described this film as a monster movie, more akin to something like Alien, Halloween, or Nightmare on Elm Street, where we know of the threat, but we never get a clear look at it. The few times that we do see Zodiac in the movie, we don't get a clear look at his face, as it's often obscured in the shadow, shot from a distance, or even disguised behind a mask. We may hear him on the telephone, but only from the receiving end. 3 different actors even play the character, giving him the quality of shape-shifting. Like most monster movies, not seeing the monster is scarier than exposing it in broad daylight. This is because it forces us to show something of our own imagination into the darkness. So what do we see when we look into the shadow of the Zodiac? So first, Fincher evokes the sense that what we see in the film, the world of appearances, is lesser than the world that we don't see. He accomplishes this by creating a tension within the visible space that the film sets out. He's constantly drawing our attention to things that never directly appear to the main characters or to us. Witness testimonies to events that we never see, the cryptograms, the letters, an allusion to a video canister that may contain videos of the murders, etc. These allusions operate to create a kind of breadcrumb trail for the characters and the viewer, and they point to something beyond what is immediately visible. In the cases where we are allowed a more privileged perspective, we're ultimately powerless. Before Paul Stein's murder, for instance, we have a bird's eye view of the taxi, but we never see the Zodiac's face or a clear vision of him. So we're fixed to the perspective where we're shown, but at the same time, we're given the sense that if we had just stepped in a little bit closer, if we had arrived at the scene just a few minutes earlier, we maybe could have seen just one more key detail. But we don't, and that space of the unknown persists throughout the entirety of the film. Next, Fincher shows us how this unknown space is ripened for speculation, turning it into something more than it is. From the start, Zodiac adopts references to popular film and literary culture to associate himself with larger-than-life figures. In the first cryptogram, for instance, he references The Most Dangerous Game, a story and later film in which a man on a deserted island, Count Zaroff, hunts humans as wild game. In the scene depicting the Lake Berryessa attack, we see the Zodiac don a black suit that is, at least according to Graysmith, reminiscent of Count Zaroff's from the film adaptation. Moreover, the Zodiac instrumentalizes the media to begin claiming responsibility for crimes after they have already appeared in the paper. Arguably, this is true of Kathleen Johns, who was abducted on the 5 freeway somewhere near Modesto, but it's unclear if her encounter was with the Zodiac. The media cycle in the film moves so quickly that few people stop to think, nor do they have the knowledge at their disposal to be able to rectify what the Zodiac actually claims. Because of this flurry of information, it gives the impression that Zodiac is everywhere. The realm beyond appearances begins to take on the status of something not only bearing truth, but a truth that surpasses that of the order of experiences. The mystery turns what is a criminal investigation into something of a metaphysical or metapsychological journey. Not only a desire for justice, but a delve into mystery or horror for its own sake. Over the course of the film, the public's obsession spirals into an ever-widening, vicious circle. The public's desire to be involved in the case generates false leads and misinformation, distracting the detective's attention. This makes it easier for Zodiac to elude the police, placing it more at stake in the investigation, and of course, elevating the myth. At a certain point in the film, it becomes clear that Zodiac becomes of interest to the public solely at the level of fantasy. This happens, Fincher notes in his commentary, when Toschi, his wife, Graysmith, and Melanie coincidentally happen to be at the same theater watching the movie Dirty Harry. Dirty Harry is a film in which the main character, San Francisco police officer Harry Callahan, is in pursuit of the Gemini killer, the Gemini, of course, being inspired by Zodiac. Toschi, annoyed mid-film, steps out for a smoke. Graysmith notices him leave and steps out as well to confront him for the first time. They talk, but eventually the movie lets out, and audience members tell Toschi they got him, Callahan catches the Gemini to the audience's satisfaction. The public has now resolved the case at the imaginary level. It can now disengage from the reality, which no longer appears to pose any imminent threat. Graysmith and Toschi, however, continue their work. Fincher captures the fallout of this sea change in a time lapse of the construction of the Transamerica building, played to the opening of Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues. Here, we see new tasks beginning and being brought to completion, life passing by as the case remains open, and Graysmith and Toschi continue alone. So, what can the movie Zodiac tell us about ourselves? This question can really be answered in three ways. First, in relation to the time it depicts. Second, in the time in which it was made. And third, how we view the movie today. First, the time depicted in the film is primarily the America of the late 1960s and early 1970s, a time when the hopes for the transformative potential of the Summer of Love had begun to give way to a cynical acceptance of old institutions, the realization that they were here for the foreseeable future. Graysmith, described in the movie as a Boy Scout, and the detectives are ultimately representatives of this establishment in the film. They do things, for the most part, as they should be, but ultimately fail in spite of their best intentions. And the media circus around them plays no small role in getting in their way. One could argue, according to the logic of the film, that Zodiac provides the occasion for the public to do two things at once: to remain fascinated by what lies beyond the limits of institutions, while at the same time powerless to change anything themselves, and insisting that those institutions stay in place. Between the investigators and the Zodiac stands a society still fascinated by transgression, but at the same time powerless to change itself, insisting that things stay the way they are, because what lies beyond it is only monstrous. And this is the source of the deadlock in the film. Second, the film can also be read through the lens of the time of its release in March 2007, putting its production in the twilight years of the Bush presidency and right before the financial collapse of 2007 and 2008. It was a time in which the nation had endured the collective trauma of a large-scale terror attack, but had now been at war and continued to be for many years to come. It was a time in which, while we were justified to fear, we remained locked in a struggle with no foreseeable end, and yet an unwillingness to shed light on ourselves. And what can the film tell us about ourselves today? Do not some of us hold the man in office as the same kind of specter, as simultaneously something to be feared, and yet which distracts us from having to make a change in ourselves? Perhaps only time will tell. That concludes our first episode on David Fincher's Zodiac. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to speaking with you next time, when I hope you'll join us for an episode on the thought of 20th century French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. This has been an episode of WinksThinks, and I have been your host, Sean Winkler. Farewell, and good night.